No, my hi to my welcome. It's really lovely to have you here today. And what we're doing is we're talking about preparing for a needs assessment. And I'm really aware that you come into this with your own context, that there's lots of people who come to these conversations going, I don't know what a needs assessment is. I don't understand the structure and how this all comes to be. And there's other people who are like, I have gone through this process so many times that I'm frustrated. And so I'm trying to meet everybody's needs. So some of it might not be quite at the right level for you, and that's cool. You just pick and choose the bits that are relevant in your situation. So if you don't know very much about flying kites, we are a teeny tiny organisation. We help people with recruitment. So if they're looking for support staff that genuinely connect with them, that have the skills or the interests or the approach that's needed to work in that situation, we try and do the legwork to make that as easy as possible. We also do goal planning and navigation, and often that is people who are stuck in trying to get access to the services that they need or trying to get what they need out of the services that they've been allocated. This conversation about how to engage with NASC is quite a common conversation that we give people some advice around. And the other thing that we have is a range of free resources, and they're all up on our website. There's a whole big comprehensive website about moving out of home, as well as some quick guides, and I'll talk about our guide to a needs assessment as we go through. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit of the basics. What is an NASC? How does that work? And then we're going to talk through that process of what you can do before a needs assessment, during a needs assessment, and after one, as well as what happens when that hasn't quite worked out. As I said at the beginning, I did write quite a long presentation, so I'm gonna try and cover all my bases while I go. So if you came last week, you will have seen a conversation about how the government structure comes together. And in this situation, we're talking about NASCs. So the government has the money, they give it to the Ministry of Social Development, and specifically the Disability Support Services portion of that giant thing that is MSD. And then they contract in each region to a NASC. And there are 16 NASCs around the country, and there will only be one in whatever region you are based in. That's the particular process, the needs assessment service coordinations, the contract that those organisations hold. And we're talking about the process they use to decide what services you can have. So it's important to note that they have a fixed amount of money, and they're trying to use that across all the parts of all the people that they need to support in that space. They also they're not government organisations; they're all independent. Some of them are companies, some of them are charities, some of them are parts of the DHB or the old DHB. And they all operate currently in really quite different and isolated manners. But one of the things that's changing next year is that there will be one consistent process and form for needs assessments. And we don't know what that looks like yet. They're saying that will give us more consistency across the country, but we haven't seen a template of those new needs assessment processes. And it's also important to know that there are other NASCs in the system. So there's a NASC for people who are over 65 and needing help, and there's a NASC for mental health support. They don't operate in the same way as the ones in the disability system, but generally it is the same process. They assess your needs and then allocate you supports. So it's the only way through. You can't go around a NASC unless you are in a region that has an EGL demonstration, which is only Waikato, Christchurch, and Mid Central. And even then, you don't normally get a lot of choice about whether or not you go through the NASC or not. Anyone can do a referral to NASC, and I think people don't always realize that literally on most of them it's a website a form that you fill in and say, this is my name, this is my NHI number, and I would like an NASC assessment, please. It tends to be that if you get your referral done through a professional, like a GP or a psychologist or who's ever given you that diagnosis, generally those referrals get picked up faster. I assume that's because they trust the information a little bit more because it's coming through from with a report and with more information. But technically, you can just do your referral yourself. But what happens, the first process is that you go into the system and you get assessed for eligibility. And I'll show you the eligibility criteria in a second. But really, the best advice around those referral processes is the sooner you can get the referral in, the better. There are lots of stories at the moment of people sitting in referral no man's land for a really long period of time. So as soon as you've got that diagnosis, you want to get the needs assessment, the referral in for a needs assessment, even if you don't know if you need support, because it might be 6 months before you even get to have a conversation with them. And in the last kind of 18 months, they have been trying to keep budgets under control, and so people have been put on hold. I guess they've put in their first referral and they've not got anywhere. And I guess now is a better time to put that referral in again. There's nothing to stop you asking for them to review your eligibility again. So the eligibility criteria that we can access as the community is really vague. It says that you will have a disability for at least 6 months, and that like it's quite fluffy. And so the hard thing in there is as you if you fit in a grey ground, they have more criteria that we don't get to see in general. But often this is what they'll just quote this to you and say whether or not you're in or not in. And what often happens is the people who fit in the gaps. So, no, that's not people who fit in the gaps. I must have taken that one out. So people with FASD and ADHD and dyslexia and things like that, they don't automatically enter into the disability system. They are not eligible for those diagnoses, do not make you eligible for a needs assessment. But autism does make you eligible for a needs assessment. No disability makes you by diagnosis eligible for support. It just gives you eligibility to have the conversation with the NASC. And so that's the first process that a NASC does, is they decide whether or not you meet the criteria. And then in most NASCs, that then goes to a different team. So some person reads your file, reads the information that you've given them, and they decide, yes, you meet the criteria to have a needs assessment or you don't. And then a different team of people will work on conducting those needs assessments. So there are changes coming to funding in 2026, like I said before. Part of that is they're taking away the purchasing rules that they put in place in 2024. But another part of it is that they are expecting that those people with flexible funding, like individualized funding, will use their funding aligned to their personal plan. And that personal plan is a thing that a NASC is going to create. So whomever you talk to at the NASC will create your goal plan. And that goal plan will be how you're allowed to spend your funding, what it's tied back to. And that is similar to what's been happening in the Enabling Good Lives demonstration. So they've had plans that have got specific goals that they're working on, and money are tied to each of those specific goals. So we assume that kind of will be a similar process. But again, we haven't seen these new NASC assessments, and it will be a bit of a holding pattern until we know what those look like. So the needs assessments are about your disability related need. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle to know, is that it's not about your need and it's not about your holistic well-being. It is about your disability related need. And so they're trying to pick apart what bit's mental health and what bit's health and what bit's family circumstance. And then this bit here is the piece that they are interested in finding you support for. And that's why often people come feeling like they have quite significant needs and walking away from a needs assessment without a lot of support, because the system has decided that actually the things they need help with are not related to their disability. And so part of what we're going to talk about is how can you make sure you get your wording right, so that things fit within the disability category. So when you do a needs assessment, theoretically, you should do a full needs assessment every 3 to 5 years. and that should be every NASC has its own rule and process. Next year, they're going to skip needs assessments from April to October. We don't know what happens to people who are due to have their full needs assessment in that time period. We assume it's all going to get bumped for a year, but it's not clear at this point. That needs assessment can be on phone, on video, or in person, and you can advocate for your preference. They will default to whatever is easiest for them, and you can advocate for whatever is easiest for you. I think at the moment they do most of them on phone or Zoom, but you can, if you need to see them in person, then tell them that you need to see them in person. And it depends how chatty you are. Generally, they take a couple of hours. I've seen them take 4, but I've also seen them take 1. And that's kind of a bit of a combination of how chatty you are as a person and how chatty and thorough the needs assessor is that you're talking to. So when we say disability related need, this is about identifying the support that you need that is different from the mainstream community. So this is where we go, this is what most people need, and this is what I need, and this is where the difference sits. And that can be really hard to get used to being able to identify. And often this is the downside of our system is that it is really deficit based. It's not talking about your talents. It's not talking about the things you've learned. It's not talking about your potential often even. It's looking at the things that you can't do and what you find really hard, which makes it really a traumatizing and depressing conversation for a lot of people. Because in fact, we don't want you to bring the good parts and the skills you have to the conversation, because that will tend to lead to getting less allocated funding. So when we're talking about disability related need, that's also particularly important when we're looking at young children. Because if you think about the support a young child needs, they develop very quickly over time. And so how much help a 5-year-old needs and how much help an 8-year-old needs are quite significantly different when it comes to being able to shower independently, get dressed independently, brush their hair, make their snacks, all those kind of daily life activities. And so being that you only get a full needs assessment often every 5 years, that's a huge period of time for needs to change when you're comparing them to other children in the community. And so often what happens, what's helpful is to think about other children, and hopefully you know some other children of a similar age to the young people you're thinking of, and being able to have that conversation that says, okay, so most 5-year-olds can do this, my 5-year-old can do this. And being able to articulate that really clearly, because also in that needs assessment, particularly when the young person's not there, the needs assessor can lose perspective of how old your young person is. And so being able to say, I know that most 5-year-olds can do this or can't do this. I know that most 8-year-olds can and can't do this. Gives you the ability to stand strongly in the need for people to be able to I guess see what piece of it is disability related. And of course, it's wonderful generalization, because just because an 8-year-old can doesn't mean an 8-year-old will. And just because some 8-year-olds can doesn't mean others can. So you're just kind of trying to paint a picture for the needs assessor that says these are the bits that we find hard, and it's disability related. It's not just because they're a kid and they need help, or not just because they're an adult and they need help. So we have on our website a 1-page summary of how to prepare for a needs assessment, and that's like the quick, short version of this whole presentation. And so what that means is that we will, you can download it at any time, and it just gives you some tips and tricks of what we're going to cover in the next little bit. And that means if you've got other people that you know who would like to know this, they can either come watch the video recording, which will be up at the end of the month, or you can send them to this lovely 1-page handout, or send them the slides from today. So before you go to a needs assessment, so they've called you and they've said, hey, it's time for your full needs assessment, let's have this conversation. before you go, you need to write down those examples of the disability related need. So you need to be able to be really clear, and often it helps to go, even ask AI, ask the internet, what can people this age normally do, and what can this young, and then you write your list of what your young person can do in comparison. Or you write down, just the pieces of the day that you find hard. And it's about gathering evidence and example that demonstrate that need. And I really encourage people to be specific, because what I find, I've sat in on lots of needs assessments and people say things like sometimes, and everyone sometimes is different. I was talking to a mum not so long ago, and we were talking about sleep. And the needs assessor said, "Oh, how did they sleep? Did they sleep all right?" She said, "Oh, it's not that bad." And so when we stopped, we went, what does not that bad mean? Because I knew the answer to this question and the needs assessor didn't. And she's like, "Oh, well, they're up at kind of 3:30, 4 a.m. every morning. If they've, usually going to sleep at 11, up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock. I can't stay in bed when they get up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock because of these risks." So she'd said, sometimes they don't sleep well. Actually, 5 days a week, they're up at 3:30 in the morning, and if they're up, she's up. That is not sometimes they don't sleep well. That is actually quite a significant drain on her ability to get a good night's sleep. But that wasn't clear by the words that she'd said in the needs assessment. So if you can be clear and write that stuff down so that you know how to say it in advance, it just increases the chance that you don't talk about what your life is normal is like in a way that people will assume you mean something else. Because often you're jumping through the topics fast. And so you said sometimes they don't sleep well, they go, cool, okay, that's not a big problem. And that's the end of the conversation. So you need to make sure that you don't miss those opportunities to be really clear about your need. Um, if you are the kind of person who struggles to represent yourself in those conversations, so struggles to talk about those details, feel like you're, having your say or correct people if they're not right, then some of the things that you can do are having someone with you in that support meeting. And I really encourage you to do that, even if you are a wonderfully confident person. Um, and be clear with that person who you invite to the meeting about how they are going to help you. Are they going to step in when you have said sometimes? Are they going to keep their own record of the conversation? Are they going to have a list that makes sure that you cover certain topics? What's their role? And give them a job to do. And most people, if they're coming to help you, they want to know what's going to be most helpful. I really encourage people to write down a list of examples and things that you want to cover and literally cross them off as you go. So you've said, I need to tell them that story about that time that scary thing happened. And you've said, I need to be specific about sleep. And you've said, I need to talk about my worries for this, kind of deterioration or something like that. And having them written down, and literally, I've talked about that, I can cross it off. And then when you get to the end and they go, is there anything else you wanted to tell us? You can read through your list and check that you've talked about the things that are most important. Because I know I get to the end and I'm like, no, that was 2 hours of talking. I probably said everything. And then I get off the phone and go, oh, I didn't talk about the thing. So having that list and keeping yourself up to date of what you've covered and not covered is really good. And if you are a person who likes to, you can write that list and you can send it to the needs assessor in writing. So you can summarize your situation and you can write it down for them. They get a little bit overwhelmed if you send them pages and pages of writing, but that nice, clear top bullet points can literally, I've seen them just copied and pasted straight into a needs assessment. So you know what works for your brain, you know what works for your family, but that can be a really good strategy to make sure things don't get lost. So then in your needs assessment, um, you don't need to tidy your house. You don't need to put your best foot forward. Be transparent about it. If you're not sleeping, if your house is a mess, if your children are screaming in the background, um, if that's not going to detract from your ability to be present in the conversation, then don't worry about those things. We used to the general advice used to be that, you get a better needs assessment the more you cry. And I philosophically don't like that as a need to present that way. But actually, it is true. They need to understand where you are genuinely coming from. They need to know if you are overwhelmed. They need to know if there are things about the situation that are worrying you. Otherwise, they're not going to give you help for those things. It is about the worst day. It is about telling them about your worries. It is about telling them about that time that everything went wrong. And it's unfortunately about avoiding telling them stories about that cool thing that happened last week, because those ones tend not to help us so much. So do watch out for those broad, sweeping questions and statements from the needs assessors. So they can do things like saying, like I said, oh, sometimes sleep's not so good. Oh, okay, good. So they're sleeping good most of the time, and they just move on. In the needs assessment we did in our household, we got the question of, so you guys are generally coping okay, aren't you? To which my husband confidently said, yeah, we're fine. That was our respite question. That was our one respite question in the entire needs assessor. And she just wrote down fine until I stopped and went, well, actually, we can't leave the house in these circumstances. These things are hard. We can't do this. And then she was like, oh, okay, right. But that was going to be our one opportunity to tell that part of the story. And it was glossed over in one question and a confident we are coping-ish from my husband. So it's watching out for those things, but also if that was written down to make sure you talked about your need for respite, you wouldn't get caught out by a sweeping question either. And again, bring people to the meeting. Don't come to the meeting by yourself if you don't have to. And often I've seen people ask the service providers that they use, the schools that they go to, the social workers that are engaged with them. If people know about the importance of a needs assessment, people are willing to come and help you in that conversation. And especially if you give them a job and say, look, I know I'm not really good at these things. I just really need someone in my corner to make sure something or other. It's really worth doing. So, or the other piece of that is, I talked before about disability related need. An important piece of disability related need is that they are not going to fund needs that they perceive as mental health needs, needs that they perceive as health needs, things about your housing or your family circumstances. And so often we use colloquial language and we talk about things as though there's something different. So we talk about a disability related need, and you think about an autistic person who maybe, picks at their skin, or somebody who I talked to a person the other day who they pull up the carpet or rip the curtains up. And when I talked to mum about it, she said, oh, it's anxiety related. Oh, it's OCD. And I said, both of those, take that behavior and put it in the category of mental health. This young man didn't have a mental health condition, or a diagnosed mental health condition, and he was autistic. Those were his stims. Those were the things that helped him feel calm and regulated. And so she was taking a thing that she actually needed support with to make sure he didn't rip up the carpet, and putting it into a category where the NASC said that's not our concern. So making sure that you don't use words like anxiety and OCD and depression, unless they are genuinely there. Don't talk about chronic fatigue unless you're diagnosed with chronic fatigue, because they assume that that belongs to a different part of the government and that belongs to a different funding stream. Whether or not you've got access to that funding stream at the moment, that's how they perceive it. And again, you can write those on your notes so that you make sure you don't use those terms, or that if you do use those terms, that you specify why you use them and that it's just your words for this thing. So after your needs assessment, they write up the piece of paper. And it is their understanding of the conversation. And I've seen some of them really far off base. Like I swear that needs assessor was in a different room than we were in. So read them and take time to understand them. Take time to go back to your list and check out whether or not all the things that you wanted represented are still on there. Um, and they use that, they then take that to put you into like a category of need. And at the moment, that gives you like a magic number that we don't get to see. It gives you a band of how much support you're entitled to. And then they come up with a proposal of support to meet your needs within the band that you're kind of allocated to. You can move bands by having needs that have not been considered when they put you in that nice little invisible box. So if you go back to them with a new risk, if you go back to them with a new behavior, a new development, a new, kind of support need, then that will move you into a different band. And that's the only way you get an increase in your funding. But what they do is they look at it and they've decided you need respite, and then they pick from the respite options available which one they're going to offer you. There are other things they can offer in some situations, but they will come back with a plan. They will come back and say, we would like to offer you this, this, and this. And I use the word offer because it isn't unmovable. Often the quantity, the dollar value, the amount that they can give you, often that is unmovable or reasonably unmovable. It's very rare that they'll offer you 10 hours of individualized funding and you'll get 30. But it's not uncommon that they'll offer you 10 hours of individualized funding and you'll get 12 if you can make a good argument for it. So I guess my feedback in that space is making sure that if they offer you a support, that you ask questions until you understand what they are offering you. The number of people who get given a support and then they don't know what it means. They don't know how it's supposed to help. They don't know what it's for. The needs assessor's job is to help you understand it. So ask them all the questions, but also ask if there was another way that you could meet that need if you aren't in love with the option that they're offering. Like I said, with respite, they can offer you carer support. They can offer you individualized funding respite. In some regions, they can offer you home support. They can offer you school holiday programs in some regions. They can offer you out-of-home respite in a facility. There's a whole lot of different ways, and they've looked at your situation and decided that this one will meet your needs. But if you don't really like it, you can have a conversation that says, is there another way? Is there another option? Even if it's just so you know what they've chosen between for you, because often they don't explain that. Often they just say, we'd like to give you this. You can have carer support, and you don't know that there was something you could have had instead. And if you aren't happy with the level of funding, the amount that they're giving you, you have to have a reason. You have to be able to give them more evidence to evidence the support need that they didn't see, that they didn't put in their report or hadn't considered. Because otherwise they can't change the funding box they've put you in. So, you might be able to get an hour or two more within the funding box that you've been given, but they can't give you a huge amount more if they don't have a justification to move you into a different category. And that's just their magic behind the scenes algorithms. So at the moment, lots of people aren't happy with the outcomes that they're getting from NASCs, and that's because disability services have not lived within the national budget in a decade. And so last year, 2024, we were told that the system must live within its budget. And so there's been huge cost pressure that has involved lots of service cuts to lots of people. That means that there is a decent chance you don't get an increase when you really need it, and in fact, a chance that you get less support when your needs have not changed. But that doesn't mean that you should just say, okay, fine, I'll just take what you're giving me. You can push back. You can advocate for what you really need. I guess if you're going to go back to the NASC and say, the needs assessor comes, they says, we'd like to give you 5 hours less support than you had last week. You have the right to complain. And the best advice there is to put it in writing and say the word complaint. If you just go back and say, I'm not very happy with that, then the needs assessor themselves can deal with that. But if you talk about complaints, then that has to go through their complaints process, and that has to get escalated. And there's a whole series of how that escalation works, that it gets escalated, to their manager. It gets compared between departments within a NASC. Then it gets compared with between NASCs. And then even if you keep pushing, then it goes right up to the national team who can review it in those circumstances as well. I've seen some of those go really, really well and have completely different outcomes. And I've seen some of those escalate and escalate and escalate, and nobody is budging. And what their logic is on that is really hard to read. But I guess you know how much capacity you've got to complain, and you know how much you can live with the change that they're offering you if you're unhappy with it. And there isn't a right or a wrong. Some people have tried using the health and disability advocacy services. They have had some really good outcomes, particularly in those situations where the NASC is saying that's a health problem or a mental health problem, and trying to, because they work across health and disability, of trying to get the other parts of the system to pick up the need that the NASC is saying is not their problem. So that can be an option. Carers New Zealand have done some beautiful work in just in providing advocacy, ensuring that there is consistency and pushing back with families when there's been something really wrong. And you can always escalate to the Health and Disability Commission as well. And there are advocates out there who are doing this work. There are all sorts of people who are pushing to try and ensure that people are getting the support that they need. But it's hard work, unfortunately. If your first initial concern isn't met, then the pushing is quite hard to get a different outcome. But like I say, if that different outcome was a year ago, now that there were kind of, I guess, a little bit less financial pressure now, and then some more changes coming next year, it's the answer you got 18 months ago might not be the answer you get now. So it's worth going back and asking for that review. So what happens now is that you've done your needs assessment, it's ticking over, you're in an in-between year. They will now check your needs assessment and your use of your services. And more often than not now, they're not even reaching out to people, they're just rolling over funding. And so before that review date, if you want a change, you need to tell them well in advance of your review date. So for example, if your review date was coming up on the 1st of November, and you wanted something different from what you had last year, you really needed to raise that with them a couple of months ago. They're taking a really long time to get around to reviews. And you have to fight harder for a change. And so asking for that now for a change on the 1st of November is going to be really hard. You can ask at any time if your needs have changed, but the best time to do it is kind of 2 or 3 months before your review date, to give them time to at least hear what you're saying. And now they may not even send you that email or call you out of the blue and ask you whether everything's okay to tick over. They are just sending new service authorizations to providers, and sometimes copying you in on those, and sometimes not even copying us in that they've happened. So I guess my advice is, again, going back to those young people, making sure that you don't just tick over if things have significantly changed in the life of your young person. You think about, a child aged 8 and a child aged 13. Their disability related needs can be quite significantly different if they're not building independence at the rate of their peers. The how much help we think an 18-year-old needs with preparing snacks, showering and dressing and choosing the right clothes for the day and cutting their own fingernails. We think that is really different for 13-year-olds than we do for 8-year-olds. And you could go that whole period of time without any changes in your support if you don't ask for them. So do flag to them that your child is aging. You'd think that would happen automatically, but do flag to them if that's a situation that you're in. And even in next year, when there are changes coming and there's a period with no reassessments happening, At any point, you can ask for a needs assessment. If your needs have changed, you can ask at any point. They need to have reasonably significantly changed. It can't just be, like a tiny little thing that won't change your support band. But any point you are allowed to go back to them, and they've said even while they're not doing reassessments, they will do them for cases where it's really required, like people leaving school. We assume those people will still be able to get reassessments next year. Um, so with those 2026 changes, um, individualized funding, flexible supports will go back sort of to what they looked like before the March 2024 changes. So I say sort of because when we all have these new NASC plans, the spending will be tied back to that personal plan that you've got from your NASC. And what it looks like in the period where not everyone has a personal plan, that's a little unclear. But it means that some of the spending that's been off the table for the last few 18 months will be possible again in the flexibility of funding, which is really nice. So I guess last slide, kind of key little bits to take away is knowing that the NASC do not look at your holistic situation. They do look at the kind of the main caregiver's needs. But they don't care that you need to go to work or you've got other children or you've got a complex housing situation. They do sometimes consider that in your need for respite. But often people, I talk to parents and they say, well, my young person left school and they've got a day service 2 days a week and I have to go to work for 5 days a week. So I need NASC funding for those other 2 days so I can keep my job. And that is weirdly not the needs assessment process's problem. They care that that young person needs support, that they need someone with them, that they need help to do these tasks. But you needing to go to work while I think a very sensible need is not something that they'll take into consideration. So you need to make sure that you're framing those things around the disability need rather than around the parents or the family realities. So it's just making sure you're getting that kind of language right, that it's not about life and reality, because they say, well, all parents need to go to work. It's just a life problem. That's not a disability problem. The situation is that that young person can't be left alone at home or whatever the situation is. Things like leaving school, it really is, particularly in this environment, asking for that funding well in advance, flagging it to the NASC, particularly if you're looking at things like moving out of home, if you're hoping to get into something like residential care, flagging that almost years in advance, so that they're not suddenly surprised by it. Sometimes that gives you more funding because they go, well, if we can give you better respite funding, you might stay home longer and stay out of residential care longer. And sometimes it's just because if you suddenly appear on their doorstep and say, this is what's happening, it can be quite hard to convince them of the jump in funding you might need in that situation. And my best advice is talk to other people. Ask other people when you see them about the support that they get and be transparent about the support that you get. It's amazing when you talk to people at schools, at recreation activities. There's lots of online support groups and like Facebook groups and things. And you talk to people and they tell you about their budgets and you realize that their situation is really similar to yours and their needs assessment outcome is really different from yours. Or you find out that there was an amazing service out there that you didn't know about and that you could really benefit from. So it's one of those things where if we talk to each other more, if we know what normal looks like for other people, then the chances of you getting the support that you need is increased, because then you know if you need to be advocating differently, then you can hear about amazing services that could be fantastic in your situation. And I think that the system really flourishes when we're isolated. When we're isolated and we are not feeling entitled to decent disability supports, then we don't do well in needs assessments. We don't put our best foot forward. So yeah, I guess that's the main advice. So this is how you find us. And yeah,